Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really delighted to be at this event. I think this is a really interesting topic to get us all in the room and to be thinking about the relationships between children's rights, the rights of persons with disabilities and older people. And it's something I've often thought upon, but I really haven't had enough time to discuss it with other experts. I'm really delighted to be here. So I'm going to talk about children's rights and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I suppose we're ahead of the game in that the Convention on the Rights of the Child has been around now for over 25 years. And it's often considered to be a really huge success because of the number of signatories. It now has 196 signatories, ratifications rather. The only UN nation that hasn't ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, as many of you know, is the United States. So it's seen to be one of the most successful of these types of treaties and conventions. What I thought I would do today, though, was start to think, maybe problematise that a little bit and think through some of the lessons perhaps that we in the children's rights community have learnt from the experience of the Convention on the Rights of the Child in the last 25 years and really begin to think, well, what advice would you offer those who were interested in having another convention for another group? So lesson one. I suppose that there's an interesting issue about the language that's used, and Philip Veerman has talked about the ageing of the Convention of the Rights of the Child, which is interesting in the context of today's conference, basically making the point that when it was being drafted 35 years ago, there was a decade of drafting right up until 1989. The people who were drafting it were basically typing on manual computers, and they were typing a draft for children who would live and grow in an age of technology. And they had no sense, really, I suppose, of how things were going to evolve for those children. And I imagine that those thinking about a convention on the rights of older people will also be, I think old age is going to change dramatically in the next 25 years. People are going to be older, there are going to be more older people, technology will be different again, health will be different. And I suppose what a convention has to do is to cope with that change. So in some ways, if you're looking at it, you're not looking at the present, you're really trying to think far into the future to a convention that will age well and will age in a way that it will cope for the needs of the newer generation of older people. And I think in some ways, well, Philip Veerman has argued that the Convention on the Rights of the Child has not done that. He talks about lots of gaps, particularly in terms of technology. I think possibly it has, and it's one of those things when you're drafting human rights treaties about getting that balance between generality and specificity. How do you draft it? How do you draft it to be able to cope? And I think Ursula Kilkelly and I have argued that actually the Convention has coped quite well. One of its biggest criticisms is that it's really broad, very vague at times, woolly, in fact. But sometimes it's that willingness that allows a convention to age and cope with what changes and what comes in that kind of dynamic way. So that's one lesson, I think. Second lesson is about being prepared for compromise, and that's nothing new to anybody who knows about human rights. It's all about compromise, and usually the compromise comes where there's controversy. I think there's a really good example in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which I'm sure is obviously going to be and currently I'm sure is one of the debates for the rights of older people. And that's how you define who's in. And in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, this was incredibly controversial in a number of respects. The first was, obviously, for the Convention on the Rights of the Child, was when does life begin? Okay, very controversial, as you can imagine. And the way that the drafters responded to that was basically just to leave it out, not define it. And again, that's interesting. But there's also an issue about, well, what's the other boundary of childhood? When does childhood stop? And the Convention on the Rights of the Child went for 18. But that's clearly not the case in many countries. In many countries, 18 is not the age when childhood stops or when adulthood is obtained, even though all of this is obviously socially constructed. And I imagine, again, as the conversation I'm hoping we might have today, is there'll be a debate about how you define who would be protected in a convention on the rights of older people. How do you do that? And I was at a presentation last year, and it was Ellen Desmet from the University of Ghent, talked about the rights of Indigenous people and talked about the idea of self-selection, that the way you define who's in is the people who choose to be in. Who defines themselves as old, who defines themselves as a child. And I think that's interesting because I think some of the work that we do in the child rights community, we find that a lot of 17-year-olds just don't define themselves as a child. They don't want to be called a child. They don't want to have to stand up and have that label. I think there's something very interesting around terminology there. Oh, why have I got Humpty Dumpty? I forgot about that. I'm sure you're all wondering. So Humpty Dumpty's there, and I suppose Humpty Dumpty's there because, of course, he's saying this Alice in Wonderland version of interpretation. You can get away with that in human rights treaties, that you can pick a word and give it the meaning you choose it to have. And I suppose that's something that will have to happen in any new convention. How will we say who's old and who's not? And you get to define it, or rather the countries who will negotiate it and agree it will get to define it, and compromises undoubtedly will be made. Lesson 3, have some general principles, and I've got a big question mark here, and I've written perhaps. I think those of you who know children's rights know that what's one of the most cited facts about the CRC, it relates to its 4 general principles, even though in fact these 4 general principles aren't called general principles in its text. What happened was that very soon after it was adopted by the General Assembly, the First Committee on the Rights of the Child got together and produced guidelines for reporting and decided there would be 4 general principles, and they plucked these 4 out and made them 4 general principles, and they have become incredibly important in the Convention. They're cited a lot, they're used for reporting processes, they're used by NGOs, academics spend ages discussing them, and I suppose what I would say is quite soon after, maybe Bruno will be talking about this, the CRPD has adopted how many general principles? 11, 12? Lots and lots of general principles, and to me they're just a chaotic list. I think this isn't particularly conceptually clear, but the CRPD is worse if you ask me. And I think if there were going to be general principles in a new convention on the rights of older people, I think that has to be given a lot of thought. Again, last year I was asked to, and only typical lawyers would do, I was asked to do an adversarial case to say there should never have been general principles, and I argued at a conference last year that they were unauthorised. I'm not sure the committee actually had the authority to do what they did with them, that they're unhelpful. I think in some ways they distort implementation of the convention. I think they're unnecessary. There are already general principles out there like non-discrimination for all human rights that we don't necessarily need for this particular group. And I think I had one other U that I've forgotten for the minute, so I'll leave it. But anyway, it was quite a strong case to say, think carefully. I think there's now this idea that conventions have to have general principles. And I think if they're going to have them, they should have a very clear conceptual basis. And that brings me to lesson 4. I think what makes sense when you have general principles is there's something about those general principles that identifies what is it about the group that you're seeking to protect that is different from other humans, that justifies having a bespoke convention. And I don't know, I do a little exercise with my master's students where the very first thing they do in my class is they sit down and they have to list the differences between children and adults. And that's a really interesting exercise. If you were asked to do it now, you'll already be having things in your head that make children different from adults. And they're often around issues of vulnerability, dependency, those kinds of issues that we assume, like size, that make children different from adults. And I think it's a helpful exercise because it gets you to think then, what I do then is we look at the Convention on the Rights of the Child and say, well, okay, how does it relate to these differences? Were they important enough differences to justify tailoring and adapting the rights that all humans, including children, have? And if there's not enough of those differences, it wasn't worth doing. And sometimes there are and sometimes they're not. And I think that would be a really interesting exercise to be done for older people. What's different, if anything, about older people from other human beings that justifies or makes us think we need some kind of additional bespoke rights in a particular treaty. Oh, another 4. That's going to be a 5. I'm on my 5th lesson. The next thing I think that is particularly interesting about the Convention on the Rights of the Child that was different from the conventions that had preceded it is the idea of non-state actors and third parties. Who are the other people in these rights holders' lives that may need to be rights holders as well, or maybe duty bearers that are not the state. And for families, I think it's particularly interesting. For children, it's particularly interesting because, of course, they are in this triad of the child, the state, and parents or carers. And I think it's really important in any other instance to identify who else might be these non-state actors. So for persons with disabilities or for older people, where does family feature? Will family be rights holders, or will family be duty bearers, or will families be both? In fact, there was a lecture last year that Michael Freeman, who would be kind of the leading scholar in children's rights, talked about the fact that there's a convention on the rights of parents embedded in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And that's a really interesting notion that you wouldn't necessarily think about. Well, will anybody else have rights embedded in a Convention on Older People? Lost track. Involve rights holders. Again, it was mentioned Michael Freeman. One of the things that we learnt about the Convention on the Rights of the Child, he was very quick as a scholar to point out that there was a huge irony in the fact that this Convention on the Rights of the Child, which emphasises the need for children's views to be given due weight in matters affecting them, didn't in any real way give children any input into that actual convention. So it wasn't drafted by children, even though it was drafted for children. And again, I think that's an important lesson to learn post that. How do you involve the rights holders themselves in the process of drafting and deciding what rights are needed? We did an interesting exercise. There was a conference to celebrate Michael Freeman's retirement, and some of us were asked to do presentations and some work related to that, and present at a conference in his honour. And we did a piece of work where we talked to children about what should be in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We had them looking at the existing text and talking about whether it was appropriate for them. And we found that actually children, there were differences in content. There were things, we just picked one provision, the right to aims of education, just one small piece. And they were talking about things that were missing for them. They felt that the aims of education, for instance, should include the right, a duty for states to educate children to be kind and caring, to think beyond themselves, which interestingly isn't there. They talked about there were differences in interpretation of existing things. I've just given you one example, this word talents, written by adults for children, but the way that children interpret talents is very different from the way that adults may interpret talents, as in this boy telling us, this 9-year-old boy saying, yeah, my big talent is Minecraft, but my teachers don't think it's a talent, you know. And also differences in language, and that was, and I'm not having time today, I've only got another few minutes, but there was a very interesting, some interesting work come out of that I would love to explore further about language. The Convention is translated into lots of languages, including the UN official languages. And we were only really working in 2 languages, English and French. But it became very clear that the French was not the same as the English. And what the French children, in this case French-Canadian children, were reading and interpreting was actually different in substance to the rights that were being read and interpreted by children in the English-speaking communities. So there's something about translation as well. And finally, about enforcement and monitoring. I'm not really sure where I'm going to go with this. I have so many thoughts, and hopefully we'll maybe get a chance to talk about it. But there is something about thinking carefully about what we're doing about enforcement and monitoring of UN treaties. And I suppose the first image is this pile of paperwork, and any of us who've been involved in UN treaty reporting processes know that the existing treaty bodies are swamped. They're absolutely swamped, the individual ones. We've introduced universal periodic review as an attempt to kind of help that. But there's just a huge amount of work and activity, and it really has to be worthwhile. It has to actually make change in the lives of the rights holders who it's trying to protect. I personally think, and there's a lot of discussion and disagreement about that the Convention on the Rights of the Child treaty body monitoring process does make a difference and has made a difference. We've seen it in our own research. We did some work for UNICEF 3 years ago now on implementation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child in law, and we saw that it was making a difference in national constitutions and domestic law, and that was a result of, you could link it pretty directly to treaty body monitoring. So there is something there, but there's also something about, is this in fact the best way? A second lesson would be around the right of rights holders having an opportunity to make an individual petition to a treaty body monitoring body. And that came very, very late in the Convention on the Rights of the Child and Optional Protocol 3. So it's only in the last 2 years that this is actually available to children in actually very few countries. Very few countries, I haven't got the exact figure on me now, that have ratified this particular optional protocol compared to the number of countries that have ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So again, one lesson might be, if you're going to have something like this, get it in early. On the other hand, getting it in early might mean you might not get the ratifications that you want, and there's always these trade-offs. Or you do something completely different. There's something creative and interesting and different way of thinking about how we do monitoring enforcement for conventions. And I think the CRPD offers an interesting model, but I'm sure Bruno will talk about that. So that's me. That's my suggestions and reflections on the Convention on the Rights of the Child to contribute to this discussion today. Thank you.